Let's get right into it. Every time a host has asked this question, you always say, that's a great place to start. So I want the same attaboy.
Okay.
Dr. Meyer.
Even if it's not, go ahead and say
Dr.
that.
Meyer, what was Darwin's doubt?
Well, that is a great place to start. It's the title of the book.
Ding, ding, ding.
And ding, ding, ding. And his masterpiece, he thought he had explained every clue but one. And the one clue that he knew he hadn't explained, and about which he had very significant doubts, was an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is the geologically abrupt or sudden appearance of the first major groups of animals in the fossil record. And this was surprising to Darwin in light of his theory, because he expected that his mechanism of natural selection and random variations would work very gradually and therefore slowly. The variations, he said, must be small and incremental in order for the evolutionary process to work. If in each new generation there were great big variations, you'd get deformed animals that would die. So in order for the natural selection mechanism to work, it had to work slowly and gradually. And therefore he expected a picture of the history of life that would show a continuous gradual change, and instead what the fossil record shows is that the very first forms of animal life arise very suddenly, not gradually. And this puzzled Darwin. In fact, he said it was a valid objection to the views here entertained, writing in The Origin of Species.
So what is, I'm going to ask some really basic sort of dumb questions in the beginning and later on some more technical ones, but what is the fossil record? Like, because it seems like this nebulous thing, and we talk about eras and all that, but help us understand. Let's go back to Geology 101.
Yeah, I had a funny experience in England where I asked a stupid question in my first semester there, and my supervisor took me aside and he said, Meyer, I know in the States you've learned that the only stupid question is the one you didn't ask. And then he said, but it's different here. But,
was that at Cambridge?
Yeah, right. I always say it's American rules in my lecture.
So he was saying that really was a stupid question.
No stupid questions at all. In fact, that's a good place to start. The fossil record is a way of referring to what we know about geology, that the sedimentary rocks stack up on top of each other. So all other things being equal, the ones at the bottom of the stack are older than the ones at the top, and that generally as you move up the column, you're moving from older to younger rocks. Now, it happens that sedimentary rocks, as opposed to the other two major kinds, preserve the remains of once living animals, and those preserved remains we call fossils. And in some cases, the fossils are incredibly well preserved. The animals are incredibly well preserved, so you can even see soft tissues. You can see. I have a fossil on my desk here of a trilobite, which is one of the kinds of arthropod animals that first arose in the Cambrian. They're fascinating creatures. They had these three separate body lobes and an articulated exoskeleton, and they also had compound eyes, a very sophisticated visual apparatus from the very dawn of animal life. And in this fossil I have on my desk, you can actually see the structure of that compound eye. So fossils are an incredible way of getting a snapshot of what life was like a long time ago.
Yeah, within a DVD produced by Illustra Media called Darwin's Dilemma.
Oh, right, excellent. Yeah,
which is a good companion piece to the book. Several of these creatures are sort of illustrated with computer graphics, and I remember the first time I watched that and saw these animals that were swimming around, these representations of them in the sea. I actually got a little creepy crawly weird feeling in the back of my neck because some of that stuff looked really exotic, like alien-like, and I was like, there is some strange stuff. And it's cool. The book has a really kind of neat style of the way you've done the illustrations with the art there. The sort of this pencil sketch art way. It's a pretty cool visual in the book itself.
Right. I got a great artist here in Seattle named Ray Braun who's done all those pen and ink drawings, and then we have also some full-color plates of the fossils. I've written the book as a scientific mystery story, so I start with the mystery of the Cambrian, and the purpose of the book is to tell the story of what's become of that mystery, how it's intensified with each progressive attempt to solve it, and how it has in the end, we've come to a place where the Cambrian explosion, which was seen in Darwin's time as kind of a minor anomaly, a small problem with his theory that he couldn't explain, it's grown up to be illustrative of a really major problem in evolutionary thought, in evolutionary theory, and that's the problem of not just the missing fossils, but explaining how you would build animals this complex, relying on a mechanism like natural selection and random mutations that does essentially rely on the random changes of genetic checks to build new genes, new information-rich structures, and new animal forms. And that's so the deeper mystery that the book addresses is how do you build an animal? How would the evolutionary process build an animal given the kind of mechanisms that it's invoking?
Dr. Meyer, would you care to postulate what Darwin would say about your book?
Well, I get asked that, and I guess I'm a little diffident about that because it's always hard to speculate. But I would have loved to have had the conversation with him, in part because in turning the corner from my critique of modern Neo-Darwinian theory to proposing intelligent design as an alternative, I actually use very self-consciously Darwin's own method of scientific reasoning.
Dr. Meyer, let me. We're not on a break yet. I want to pause real quick. Everybody, please listen to what Dr. Meyer is about to say, because first, let me set up the straw man, and we're sort of jumping ahead. We're going to go back and forth in the show, but often it's postulated something along the lines, okay, so there's some problems in the fossil record, so you're just saying magic happened instead and God did it, but what you're about to say explains the method by which you use, and people must absolutely get this. It is so essential to understand the larger case of ID. Now, with that preface...
Yeah, thanks for stopping me. No, that's good. That's good context, because we're not making an argument from ignorance or a God of the gaps argument. The argument for intelligent design is based on what we know about life, about animal life, and about the cause and effect structure of the world. That is to say, the kinds of causes that are necessary to produce the effects that we see and that have to be explained. So I set out to grad school in the mid-'80s, and I've been exposed to some of the work on intelligent design to that point. And I wondered if that argument, that intuition that intelligent design was necessary, could be formulated as a rigorous scientific argument. I got deeply into the study of Darwin's own methods of reasoning, and I realized he was using a very different method of scientific investigation. He knew that you couldn't get trilobites to appear all over again in the laboratory under controlled conditions. We weren't going to have origins events repeating themselves in the lab. So he had to use a different method of scientific reasoning. And it's a kind of a forensic style of reasoning where you move from the effects back to the causes that explain the events you're trying to ultimately account for. So you have to reason from the clues that are left behind back to the causes. And that method of reasoning, as I was mentioning before, has a name. It's called inference to the best explanation. Now, what makes an explanation best? And here's where Darwin had a great principle of reasoning that he got from his scientific mentor, Charles Lyell. The idea was that if you're going to, the best explanation is one that invokes a cause which is known to have the power to produce the effect in question, the effect you're trying to explain. And when I started to digest that, the light bulb went on for me, because the big cause that has to be, or the effect that has to be explained with the Cambrian explosion is not just the explosion of the animals themselves, but the explosion of the information, all the new information that comes online that provides the instructions for building those animals. We know a lot of those instructions are in DNA. We know some of the information resides elsewhere in animals. But the big question is, where did it come from? Well, what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which Darwin and his mentor Lyell affirmed is the basis of all scientific reasoning, is that information always arises from an intelligent source. There was an information scientist who said that information is habitually associated with conscious activity. Now, is that true, I asked myself? Well, actually, then I started to look at the examples, whether you're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a section of computer code or even information embedded in a radio signal. When you find information and you trace it back to its ultimate source, you always come to a mind, not a material process. So not only is it the case that the Neo-Darwinian mechanism can't generate information, it's also the case that there's another cause of which we know that is capable of generating information, and that is intelligence, or what we call intelligent design. And so the argument for intelligent design is based on scientific evidence, on a standard method of scientific reasoning, and it's not based on ignorance. It's based on what we know about the cause and effect patterns in the world and what we know about the only cause which is capable of generating information, and that's intelligence.
So again, if I'm understanding it, you're saying it's based on looking at the world as it is today. It's not sort of coming in from outside and importing something. You're saying based on what we see, the most likely conclusion is there is intelligent design behind it.
Right, exactly. If we found digital code or information in a typographic or alphabetic form, which is how the information in DNA has been described, in any other realm of experience, we'd immediately conclude that it was the product of a mind, of an intelligence, not an undirected material process. If you walk into the British Museum and look at the Rosetta Stone, you don't say, "Oh, gee, isn't it wonderful what wind and erosion did?" You immediately recognize that there was a mind, an intelligence, a purposive intelligence behind those information-rich inscriptions.
It's just when we get to the ultimate sort of origin, it becomes more controversial, what in any other context would not be controversial. When we return, we'll be talking with Dr. Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute about his brand new book that is indeed a bombshell on the playground of the paleontologist, Darwin's Doubt.
The problem of the Cambrian explosion is, again, twofold. The first is the problem of missing ancestral fossils, which are expected on any kind of gradualistic theory of evolution, including Darwin. But the second problem is the problem of explaining how these animals originated, and by that I'm talking almost in an engineering context. How would these animals have been built? By what process or mechanism or cause? What cause could have built the key features that we see of these animals? And in the book, I challenge the Neo-Darwinian account of how animals of this complexity could be built. And I actually have 5 separate scientific arguments that I make based on some really cutting-edge developments in different disciplines and subdisciplines of biology. So that's the second part of the book. And then in the third part of the book, having established that the Neo-Darwinian mechanism and other similarly undirected materialistic evolutionary mechanisms are inadequate to account for the form and the information that we see arising in the Cambrian event, I then propose intelligent design as a solution.
Here, what about this question, Dr. Meyer? And I think we've discovered it, but maybe you could even drop some of the numbers as far as the phyla go, or kind of explain what you mean. What actually is the Cambrian event? So what is before what we understand to be the Cambrian era? What happens then, and then what's after, and why is it sort of the mystery? Like, I still want to make sure people are totally understanding what actually we see and why that matters, and how it's irreconcilable really with the theory, not just like a kink, like a problem that is really ultimately unsolvable, especially when you look at some of the numbers, some of the time, and then even the mathematical probability or improbability
there's
of
a
what it
couple
would take.
sets of numbers. One is just the number of what are called phyla. That's the largest division in the biological classification of animals. So an individual phylum corresponds to a unique body plan, like the arthropods, of which a trilobite is an example. But another example of a phylum would be something like a chordate, with an internal skeleton, or notochord. The arthropods have an external skeleton. So you can see that right away there's some really big differences in the design logic of the kinds of animals that arise. So
it's kind of like saying automobiles, airplanes.
Versus airplane versus ship. That kind of difference in form.
About how many do we have
23
currently?
of those unique body plans are present in the Cambrian.
Okay.
20 arise suddenly with no discernible ancestors in the Precambrian. And the 3 or so that go back into the Precambrian just originate suddenly in the Precambrian a little bit earlier.
So like what, sponges?
Sponges, probably a primitive mollusk, and maybe 1 or 2 others. So but the pattern is of pervasive discontinuity. Even in the Precambrian, the forms arise suddenly, and the Cambrian forms have no discernible connection to those 2 or 3 or 4 phyla that arise in the Precambrian. So
you have what's called the terminal ends of the ends of the bush.
That refers to Darwin's tree of life. There's some terminology that goes there. His tree of life is his depiction of the history of life. The terminal branches represent the forms of life that are the result of all the evolutionary history, and then the internal branches and the nodes represent the connection points, the intermediate forms. And one of the scientists who was skeptical about Darwin's theory from the very beginning was a paleontologist, Louis Agassiz. He knew that Darwin thought that the fossil record was incomplete, but he said, why is it selectively incomplete? Why is it that the terminal branches representing, all those animal forms are present, but the nodes are not represented at all? That sounded fishy to him. The stuff that we know exists is well documented. The stuff that Darwin says must exist is never documented at all.
And so it's not really like a tree. You described it with another analogy.
Yeah, more like a lawn, or maybe better, even more apt, an orchard of separate trees in which none of the trunks of the trees marry up and connect underground.
So it's as if you have the letter Z in the fossil record without A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You don't have any of the tinkering before that you would need, and you have a bunch of them all at once.
Right. It's a great analogy. You could also maybe think of colors and think you would want to have a rainbow of intermediate forms leading from, violet to red or something, and in fact, you get violet, you get red, you get nothing in between. So
then what do you have after that? Like, what do we have now? Because I heard you mention before, not all of the phyla are even documented in the fossil record, but out of the ones we have now, how do those numbers
there
work?
There are 36 total phyla by one count. That's the count that we use in the book. Of the 36 that are documented, about 27 have been documented in the fossil record. The rest we only know of from existing organisms. And of those 27, 23 are in the Cambrian period, and 20 first appear in the Cambrian, with those other 3 appearing just a smidge earlier.
So those are really important numbers for people to see why this is called an explosion.
No, it's a big deal. It's not a minor anomaly, as Darwin thought it was in his time. He thought it was just that one little thing he couldn't explain.
Then how does the Burgess shale relate to that? It makes the explosion get bigger, doesn't it?
It makes it more explosive. So does the discovery in southern China and near Chengjiang and the Maoshishan shale. The subsequent Cambrian finds are part of what have documented the large number of separate animal body plans that have arisen. And so the number of phyla that are documented in the Cambrian has increased since Darwin's time rather dramatically. The brevity of the explosion has also increased. Now, the most explosive pulse of the Cambrian radiation takes place within about a 5 million year period. And that's not only geologically abrupt and sudden, it's a small percentage of geologic time, I think about 0.1%, but it's also biologically sudden in relation to the creative power of the Darwinian mechanism. And this speaks to some of those other numbers you were talking about. Turns out that evolutionary biologists, have a subdiscipline of their field called population genetics that has some mathematical equations that allow biologists to calculate how much change can take place in a given period of time if they know certain factors like mutation rate and generation time, population size, and the like. When biologists have started to apply, when geneticists have started to apply those equations to analyzing what are called coordinated adaptive mutations, structures that require 2 or more mutations to arise in a coordinated fashion, what they find is that the calculated waiting times for that small level of change grows exponentially with each additional mutation necessary. And so when you look at, there's been several studies, but just 3 coordinated adaptive mutations require waiting times that exceed the known history of life on the planet, let alone the small percentage of that time that corresponds to the Cambrian explosion.
It's literally impossible. There's just not enough time.
It's not going to happen with the Darwinian mechanism. And of course, the Cambrian explosion wouldn't require just 3 coordinated mutations, many, many more than that to build all these animal forms. And so even if you say the Cambrian explosion isn't 10 billion years or 10 million years or 5 million years, maybe you want to say it's 30, or one scientist even tried to stretch it out to 80. Doesn't really matter. It's a moot point in relation to the creative powers of the Darwinian mechanism. There just simply isn't enough time for that mechanism to build that amount of animal form.
And this era is thought to be about 350 million years ago. Is that correct?
About 530 million years.
I inverted it.
Yeah, no problem. Main pulse of the explosion.
All right, when we come back, I'm going to ask you about the scientific literature versus popular reception.
One of the big things the book looks at is the problem of the origin of genetic information, because you have to have that information to build an animal, certainly one as complex as a Cambrian trilobite or fish. And the Darwinian idea about how information arises is that natural selection acts on a series of mutations, random changes in the genetic material in DNA. But one of the things, and so from the Darwinian point of view, you would expect the genome to be littered with the failed trials. It's essentially a trial and error process So there ought to be a lot of failed trials that are accumulating in the genome, mutations that don't do anything. And in the 1980s, when it was discovered that only about 3% of the DNA is involved in providing information for building proteins, it was quickly assumed by the Neo-Darwinians that the other 97% or so of the genome was so-called junk. It was the detritus, the leftovers of that trial and error period, just as they expected. Well, in the 90s, as we started making arguments for intelligent design based on the presence of functional information in the DNA, the parts that code for proteins, the advocates of intelligent design said, we predict that non-coding DNA will be shown to be importantly functional, because while we accept that mutations are real processes, real things that happen, we would not expect that if the genome were designed by an intelligent designer, that it would be 97% a waste product and 3% business end. We thought that the signal should dwarf the noise, not the other way around.
So there's a predictive aspect of the ID model.
Absolutely. And people say intelligent design doesn't make predictions.
Right.
Well, there's a really critical discriminating prediction, a prediction that we made that was opposite to what Neo-Darwinism predicts. And starting in the mid-2000s, and then especially with the announcement last fall of the results of the ENCODE project, the prediction based on the theory of intelligent design has been borne out by independent research being performed by people who are not advocates of intelligent design but are part of the federal science establishment, in fact. And the ENCODE project has shown that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA is functional. We think the figure is actually much higher. And overall, the non-coding sections of the DNA are functioning much like an operating system in the computer, which in a computer, which are directing the timing and regulating the expression of the coding files, the data files. So what it's showing is actually that the argument we've made for intelligent design based on molecular biology 101 is powerful, but there's other levels and layers of information that's coming with new discoveries that are really reinforcing and strengthening the case.
And that is dealt with in Jonathan Wells' book, The Myth of Junk DNA, which
absolutely.
I love the cover. It's got like the double helix like in a trash can.
Yeah, right. And I actually discussed it extensively in Signature in the Cell as well, not as extensively as Dr. Wells has done in his separate book on the topic, but I indicated that it was a key prediction of intelligent design that was starting to be borne out. But then in this last fall, 2012, we had a major confirmation of that with the publication of these 30-some-odd important scientific papers that were part of the ENCODE project.
Right.
Well, we may get into this into the next segment, but I'll begin with the question and see how far we can go. I imagine those who hold to evolutionary theory would have some objections or some alternate ways of dealing with the dilemma that you bring up in your book. What are the one or two biggest objections people
oddly,
offer?
The biggest objection to what I argue is not scientific, it's philosophical. The New Yorker reviewed the book the second week it was out, and it gave the book a number of backhanded compliments, one of which was that it was a masterpiece of pseudoscience. And I actually appreciated that because it was a comment that clarifies the key issue. Why is the theory of intelligent design, why is the inference to design that I make from the presence or the explosion of information in the Cambrian pseudoscientific? Well, it's only pseudoscientific because, first of all, it's not pseudoscientific because I don't use a standard method of scientific reasoning, or I'm not basing my case on evidence. We already discussed that. It's pseudoscientific because it invokes a non-materialistic cause. It invokes conscious activity, intelligence as a cause. And there has been, since Darwin's time, a convention that's grown up in science that says if you want to be a real scientist, if you want to propose a scientific theory, you must limit yourself to strictly materialistic explanations of all phenomena. And while I accept that materialistic explanations provide good explanations of many phenomena, there are some kinds of things of which we know in our experience that are not well explained by matter in motion alone.
Be back in a second. We've been having a wonderful, robust discussion here about Stephen C. Meyer's new book. It's the latest installment in the Twilight Saga, and it's going to do as well as his other ones, I believe. We're going to play some clips from the film that was based upon his book. Oh, wait. that's Stephanie Meyer. Oh, okay, sorry, wrong. But it's kind of funny if you type in on Google Stephen Meyer, you'll get all these Stephanie Meyer ones about Twilight. But
that's really funny because we were on vacation at Forks, in Washington, where all these novels are set, and I didn't know a thing about them. And we walked into the bed and breakfast, and the woman said, "Are you Twilighters?" And we were getting in late, so I said, "Sure." And my kids just rolled their eyes. They knew exactly what you meant.
That's great.
Yeah, but no, the book is Darwin's Doubt, and actually the book is doing well, especially for a book of this size and of this nature. It's a rather large book and pretty detailed, although you have stuff in there to be able to keep those who have only taken the Rocks for Jocks level geology class. But
I try to explain the science as I go. I used to teach freshmen, and I also wrote it as a mystery story to carry folks along with the scientific argument. So I hope it is accessible, and so far we've got pretty good feedback on that score.
And it's doing well at Barnes & Noble, and has done pretty good on Amazon as well. Right when it's come out fresh out the gate, it's doing pretty well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, we were kind of shocked. After the first week's sales, it made several of the bestseller lists, and that was really exciting. It debuted at number 7 on the New York Times list, which was, for a nonfiction title about science, it shocked me. I was mainly just grateful for all the promotional work that our folks at Discovery and at the publisher Harper One had done. So it's been an exciting couple of weeks.
And so when we left off on the other side before, I made the lame joke there, we were talking about definitions and how a big objection to this project is to say, well, intelligent design ID, what Stephen Meyer is promoting, is not science. And first of all, it's a matter of sort of definition, semantics, because let's just say, okay, you want to define it out that way. Now, this is just strictly speaking on logic. I don't agree with the charge, but logically speaking, just strictly on logic, that doesn't necessarily mean it's false.
The argument, if you say,
doesn't mean it's not true.
It's not scientific, it's philosophical, or it's not scientific, it's metaphysical, or it's not scientific, it's religious. It doesn't say that it's false. You're just recategorizing the argument. I think it is scientific because it's using a standard method, which by convention we accept as a scientific method, the very method that Darwin used. So if you say intelligent design isn't science, you'd have to say the same of Darwin. But this other convention of materialistic explanation only, sometimes called the convention of methodological naturalism, is the grounds by which people say, well, Meyer's argument is pseudoscience or it's not science or whatever. But as I was saying before the break, there are some phenomena which are not well explained or explained at all by reference to purely materialistic causes. And information is one of those. Whenever we find information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process.
Yeah, there is no process that we know of, some materialistic, naturalistic process that generates new or novel information. It can rearrange or shuffle the deck of something that's already there, but that doesn't explain the
origin of the information in the first place.
And that's a big
exactly
deal.
Right. Yeah.
And Darwin was not aware of that. You point that out in your previous book, A Signature in the Cell, which gets into the information, how it runs the show of all these body plans and body designs. But it's important for people to see. And here's the thing, Dr. Meyer, what you're drawing from is, yes, your own work and expertise. I mean, you did work for an oil company in Texas and had to do some of this stuff up on the fossil record, and you did go to Cambridge and study some stuff there. It ain't like you don't know what you're talking about. But you're also drawing from critiques from within the technical papers. It's just the popular perception and sort of the knee-jerk reaction defenders that where the problem is. But this is established much of what you're saying.
Right. One of the themes of the book is that there's a huge disparity between the popular presentation of the status of Neo-Darwinian theory, the standard textbook theory of evolution, and its actual status in the peer-reviewed biological literature. And so in marshaling my critique of the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, I draw on research that has been done by some of my colleagues at Discovery Institute and our sister organization Biologic, which is where our main lab headquarters are. But I'm also drawing on critiques that are found in the standard evolutionary biology literature, in the peer-reviewed technical scientific literature. And so, the this isn't like we're manufacturing a controversy. There's a real problem with the creative power of natural selection. One scientist says it explains the survival but not the arrival of the fittest. It can explain the little stuff, the small-scale modifications, but not the origin of fundamentally new forms of life, such as a rise in the Cambrian period.
And wasn't there even a book recently by, I believe, evolutionary biologist, I think late last year or something, that had some similar critiques of Neo-Darwinism, although it didn't...
There's a really important book out this spring about the Cambrian explosion by two Cambrian experts, James Valentine and Doug Irwin, and it was reviewed in Science. And in the first paragraph, the reviewer said, that Irwin and Valentine show that the Cambrian explosion is one of the, outstanding or salient mysteries in all of evolutionary biology. It hasn't been explained. So when I argue that intelligent design is the best explanation for this event, people may not like that. They may want to classify it as something non-scientific, but there really isn't a better explanation that's on offer. And Valentine and Irwin, of course, don't accept intelligent design, and they're proposing that scientists need to adopt a more interdisciplinary approach to try to get a handle on a problem this severe. But they also say that there is no known biological process of which we are aware in the present that can account for the kind of changes, the large-scale changes that we see occurring in the fossil record in the Cambrian period in the remote past.
So it sounds as if evolutionary biologists, evolutionists, are basically still hoping, praying that maybe through different scientific methods or maybe through new discoveries, this problem will be solved. I mean, from what you've just said, this most recent book...
I don't know how many of them are praying. Some of them are, but I think that there is the hope. There's a commitment to find a solution to this problem, as there is to the problem of the origin of the very first life, which was the subject of my first book, Signature in the Cell, from within a naturalistic framework.
And that gets into part 3 of the book, correct, Dr. Meyer, which is titled After Darwin What? And you do something that I don't know if this has ever been done in this way. I mean, I'm not the expert on this, but like where you've put together sort of the new models that are being put forth as alternatives to the standard model. There's one in the back in the day, punctuated equilibrium by Eldridge and Gould. I think that's fallen by the wayside. But what about these newer models, and why are they being proposed? I mean, what's going on with the newer models?
Because evolutionary biologists themselves recognize that Neo-Darwinism, and particularly the mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutations, does not have the creative power that is necessary to account for things like Cambrian animal forms. I was on Tom Hartman's show yesterday, and he kept accusing me and my colleagues of manufacturing a controversy, and I pointed him to the fact of the new theories that are being developed in evolutionary biology itself, because the evolutionary biologists recognize that there's some big conceptual problems in the standard Neo-Darwinian approach to things. So there's a real crisis in the field, a real problem, and a real controversy. These new theories are attempting to remedy some of the problems of Neo-Darwinism, and I describe those at length in the book so that readers have a sense of the lay of the land, and also that when I'm arguing for intelligent design as the best explanation, I can justify the claim that it really is best, because I also critique these new theories and show that while they have a number of virtues that Neo-Darwinism doesn't, they too all fail to explain the origin of either the epigenetic or the genetic information, or both. In other words, the different two types of information that are necessary to build animal forms. A lot of the theories actually simply presuppose the pre-existing sources of information and then point to processes that ensue as a result of those information-rich structures. But that begs the ultimate question that I think has to be accounted for, which is the origin of the information that we know is necessary to build Cambrian animals.
Can you talk about one model just briefly before we talk about the alternative for which is ID? Could you talk about? But I want to ask you which one.
Oh, yeah.
Natural magic.
No, well, that's a term that one of the self-organizational theorists used in a sense actually to tout the benefits of a view of self-organization. He said it brings enchantment to nature back. But the idea of self-organization is, instead of natural selection acting on random variations, you have some combination of natural selection and these law-like regularities, processes that arise in a lawful, not a random way within living systems. And there are processes like that, but the important thing you need to know about them is that these self-organizational processes that take place, for example, in the development of animals, all presuppose large amounts of pre-existing information.
Right.
In fact, one of the scientists that proposes this talks about the Precambrian genetic toolkit, and he just sort of presupposes the existence of such a thing,
right,
but without explaining it. So
yeah,
it just does not solve the ultimate problem.
Now, let me ask you one other question I don't know if you'll ever get. Now, follow me with me for a second on this. We hold to something here called presuppositional apologetics, which is, one is you don't grant, now this is more related to sort of strictly Christian worldview issues, what I'm referring to. The unbeliever is, now, so this is different than exactly what you're talking about, but you don't grant them their assumptions. You challenge them from within their worldview to ask them if they, within their own worldview, can account for the assumptions they have, meaning they have to be able to justify the very ability to have true knowledge. They have to be able to justify regularity of nature. They have to be able to justify laws of logic.
Cornelius Van Til.
Yeah, so you go back and do that. Yeah. However, there's another part within the presuppositionalist model that says then you take both feet and step inside the worldview and run sort of an internal critique from within the rules established of the worldview. So not an outside thing, an inside thing. So within that, this is where the question is going to be weird, but I think it'll make sense. A young Earth creationist, hypothetically, utilizing that, saying, here's even your own model, guys, could actually still utilize what you're putting forth. Now, I know you're not a YEC guy, but hypothetically, do you think they could, because they're saying within your own framework, guys, you have problems? Do you see what I'm saying?
The theory of intelligent design is not addressing the question of the age of the Earth.
Yes.
So there are both young Earth and old Earth creationists, as well as certain kinds of theistic evolutionists who would also accept the arguments we're making and then incorporate them into their own framework. Because clearly any creationist also has to believe that there is a purpose of intelligence responsible for life as we see it. And theistic evolutionists of a certain kind, the kind that see God actually in some way directing or guiding the evolutionary process, would also be proponents of a form of intelligent design.
But they could say, like, for example, even within your own time frame here in the Cambrian area, based upon your assumptions and your model, you still don't have enough time. You see, it's an internal critique.
That's absolutely the case. There is not enough time even within I mean, one of the other chapters that we haven't discussed is just looking at the problem of building a new gene or protein, and I show that the complexity of a single gene or protein is such that if every organism that had ever lived from the dawn of time had been, in effect, searching through mutational processes, that process of generating one new gene per generation, which is an insanely optimistic kind of assumption, because replication of organisms has to occur with fidelity to maintain organismal structure. But in any case, if every organism generated a new gene looking for a new gene, you'd only search about 1/10 trillion of the possibilities that need to be searched to find one. So it's a big needle in the haystack problem, and there's not enough time to search.
Dr. Meyer, we have 1 minute for you to lay out why you think ID does work then instead.
Well,
in this case,
the main point would be the causal adequacy of the cause we propose. What we know from experience is that there's only one type of cause that generates explosions of functional information, and that cause is intelligence or conscious or rational activity. There are other features of the Cambrian as well that I look at, actually 5 or 6, maybe 7. Both the pattern of fossilization and other structures in animals. Like, there are these fascinating circuitry, systems of circuitry that are responsible for organisms to develop properly. They're literally integrated circuits. And we, again, know of only one type of cause that generates integrated circuits, and that is intelligence.
Intelligence. Dr. Meyer, thank you for joining us. I encourage people to pick up this book and look at the more detailed argument, Darwin's Doubt. Let's do some listener feedback from Omar Call, former debate partner of mine. I miss you greatly, Omar. You moved to L.A. and left me high and dry. And we're not going to interact with everything he says. It's rather long, but I at least want to get it out there because I appreciate the time he took and the spirit and vein in which he did it. So let me read some of it, and then Pastor Bob, maybe I'll let you. Well, do you have it in front of you?
I do.
All right, I'll let you take over. Let's read some listener feedback from our atheist friend, Omar. What's he say?
He says, on what day of creation did the Cambrian explosion occur?
Stop right there. So what he's saying is, if you're basing these timings, then how do you have, if you're reading Genesis literally, as he puts it, then what do you do with the Cambrian explosion? That's part of what he's trying to say, which is a clever way to ask the question, actually. So if obviously Dr. Meyer is what you might call an old Earth creationist, as I think almost all the ID guys are, except for Paul Nelson. But what I brought up in the show is, and I think it's a valid point, I was saying that even if a person is referring to themselves as a YEC, young Earth creationist, they can say, on your own dating, your model doesn't work. That's the way I would phrase it. Within the internal framework of evolution, the Cambrian explosion is a real event and a real problem. But others say, no, I hold to the general time frames that are generally accepted, but I am what you might call an old Earth creationist, so I believe this is a real event, and here's the problem. So they would use it in a different way than a young Earth creationist would. But continue on, unless you guys want to comment.
I did... Go ahead, Ramon.
No.
Oh.
Does it go on?
He continues, right. I did listen to the whole show. I don't feel like I heard an answer to this question. Well, Vocab, if you had to answer that question just as it is, on what day of creation did the Cambrian explosion occur, how would you respond?
I would say the question doesn't. I don't want to say it doesn't make sense, but it doesn't go together. Meaning, I don't hold that the Cambrian explosion happened on a day of creation. If I hold the literal days of creation, which I think I do, I don't have the Cambrian explosion taking place on one day, in the sense I would have explosion of all animal life, depending on what kind of animal they are, and whatever day the Bible says that happened.
Okay.
But Dr. Meyer would not hold to that. He would phrase it in a different way. He would interpret Genesis days differently than I would there.
Well, so how would Dr. Meyer answer that question?
I don't want to do that. I don't know.
He goes on to say, I think it is interesting that Dr. Meyer seems to presuppose that an intelligent designer, whoever he is, utilizes the process of evolution to produce the various forms of life we see today and the many extinct ones that we don't.
I don't know if that's correct. Well, I know that Dr. Meyer does not hold to evolution. He's not a theistic evolution. He has skepticism about Neo-Darwinism. So he doesn't presuppose that. Now, there are some ID guys who do. I think Michael Behe is an evolutionist, for example, but he's an ID guy. But he does hold to the sort of standard dates. Maybe that's where some of the confusion comes in there, where he's saying he presupposes the process of evolution. However, maybe Meyer is like the RTB guys, which have a progressive creationism, which generally speaking seems to be the idea that God is creating multiple times along the way or something like that. Perhaps that's what it is, but I don't know, so I don't want to speculate any further.
All right, he goes on. If countless generations of animals, not to mention the entire branches of the tree of life, perished prior to the arrival of Homo
Adamensis, he's just saying Adam,
yeah,
I think.
On the scene, Adamensis on the scene. Then perhaps the original creation was not as prelapsarian as a strict interpretation of Genesis might otherwise lead one to suppose.
I think what he's saying is there, if you've got all this death before the first man, then maybe creation was not as pristine as you would presuppose. The questions are actually really insightful, what he's saying. This is a common problem young Earth creationists bring up to old Earth creationists, saying, if you've got Adam and all this stuff that has happened before it, if Adam is arriving late on their standard dating method, or the first man, whatever you want to think of it as, depending on your interpretation there, then what about all this death prior to Adam? Isn't that a problem? And they have different ways of answering that, but that's what he's bringing up. So they're actually insightful questions, what he's saying, that really get more to the issue between old Earth and young Earth than really evolution versus creation, I would say.
I think Kirshner and Gerhardt, did I pronounce that right?
I think so.
Roundly provide an explanation to quote Darwin's doubt in their 2005 book, The Plausibility of Life, Resolving Darwin's Dilemma. Kirshner and Gerhardt explain how the Cambrian explosion is not, in fact, a real problem for the plausibility of the Neo-Darwinian model, given recent discoveries in evolutionary genetics, specifically the observation that broad phylogenetic variations in evolutionary novelty are expected outcomes of conserved biological core processes that all animals share, now and since before the Cambrian. The mechanics of evolution do not act on these conserved processes is well established.
I just wanted to read it because he wrote it, but two things. One is I have not read that, so I'm not familiar with it. And secondly, Luke wanted something, so I was distracted from the rest of the comment and didn't have time to formulate a proper response there. But let's go to the next one.
But thanks for writing it, Omar.
Yes. What else does he say there? There's a big word here, eukaryotic. So that's how you say that, Pastor Bob.
Thus, the biological functions that are all eukaryotic organisms share only had to evolve once. That explains why we all share them, as these processes are conserved and evolution does not alter them. The genetic modules that code for the body plans of arthropods, vertebrates, and even mollusk and simpler organisms are running the same programs. And they have been running the same program ever since before the Cambrian.
A few things. How is evolution so smart that it seems to have a teleology or a teleos? How does evolution, it's not self-aware, have an end goal of what it needs to conserve?
Because it's random.
Is only, yes, but it's only doing survival of the fittest. How does it know what it needs for the future? It doesn't have foresight. Part of what I see in some of these answers that these guys give is they act as if evolution makes a change and then says, I'll need this for later, so I'll keep it around, even if it's not useful at that moment, because sometimes that happens. But I'll put it in my back pocket and pull it out when I need it again, because the changes can get destroyed. Where does this holding tank come from? Because evolution doesn't have foresight or planning. That's one thing. The other thing is, and it's hard not to jump on this, but this teleological language keeps on getting in the mouth of evolutionists because they simply can't help it. They're running the same programs. They have been running on the same program. Does anyone else understand why that's a problem for evolution? Who is the programmer? Program is information.
So again, he assumes an order and a plan before we got there.
They end up anthropomorphizing or even turning it into a deity, evolution, when it's not.
Yeah, good point.
Let's go on.
To say that the mechanisms for speciation don't have enough time to do what they need to do seems a strange claim for someone who is suggesting a intelligent designer. Designed all organisms using the same genetic templates and modules, but did so 500 million years ago, making it appear that they do and have evolved from an ancestral unicellular atom, even though this isn't actually the case.
We'll keep on going from there. Let him. What else does he say next?
It is the intelligent designer, whoever he is, intelligent enough to create an origin of life and mechanism of propagation so excellent that it does not only appears, and it sure does appear, to operate in its own via natural processes and by its own momentum, or does this intelligent designer need to continually tinker with the mechanisms of operation by which it falsely appears to proceed in order to keep it running smoothly? That seems a very peculiar argument to make in defense of an intelligent designer.
So if you're a progressive creationist where you have God sort of jumping in the process every now and then, maybe these are relevant. But even that I don't think is really what progressive creationists say. They say God could have his own reasons for creating in spurts or being involved more at different points. Now, I don't really hold to those kinds of ideas. I have a definitive kinds producing after kinds theology based upon the Genesis narrative, but they're not bad questions, but maybe they misunderstand some of what an OEC, old earth creationist or progressive creationist, would say. Maybe we'll pick this up on the other side, BPR.
Let's go. This is Backpack Radio. We're going to talk about Sola Scriptura, but we spent the first section on more listener feedback. A long email from our friend Omar Call. We don't normally read these long emails. Shorter's better, but Omar's a friend, and he wrote a thoughtful email. He's an atheist, and so was responding to our show on creation, or rather intelligent design. One more paragraph, vocab, and we'll wrap it up. He finishes his email by saying, even if you accept the fact of evolution by intelligent design, surely you feel the weight of the challenge that it would take an even more intelligent designer than one you are thinking of to design an origin of life so self-sufficient that it doesn't need a meddling hand to help it continue along as self-sufficiently as it appears to. Do you?
Yeah, so good questions, and we didn't respond to everything Omar wrote. That's not the main topic of the show, and it's probably not the greatest radio to spend the whole time reading this pretty technical language and then interacting with it. But we wanted to say some things because he obviously put some thought into it, which I appreciate. I think there's really good things that he says there. This is from the show Darwin's Doubt by Stephen Meyer. But if you have a view of Genesis that says God did create in 6 consecutive days the life that we see, and he did it sort of definitively, meaning there's a stasis that then would proceed, kinds would produce after kinds, then you're not going to have speciation, which is essentially something turning into what it's not at any point through random mutation acting on natural selection, which is sort of the evolutionary picture of the world. This also, of course, this reading of Genesis would get rid of the idea of a common ancestor. And all that notwithstanding, even if you hold to the standard sort of geological dates that are given, what the book's main point there, it doesn't really get into that stuff I just said. What the main point is, it's saying that there's a real thing in the fossil record where you have all this unprecedented life, new body plans and life form, it appears, just pop into this layer called the Cambrian era, and then they don't have evolutionary predecessors, and then after that, they either go extinct or they remain stable like what we see today. And that's what you see a lot in the fossil record is stasis. The changes you see are changes that everyone accepts. Natural selection or microevolution, small adaptive changes. We all believe that. It's observable, empirical fact. The Bible, I would say, even, depending on what you want to do with this, has things about breeding and changing the way things look. It's like ancient people knew this and could control breeding. They understood you could sort of produce within they wouldn't use this phrase, genetic pool, some variation. It's not novel or new. We believe that. It's obvious. So finches really can have different types of beaks, but they're still finches and they still have beaks. They can only mutate, if you want to use that phrase, or adapt within their pre-established stable genetic pool that they have. Nowhere does new genetic information get put into the mix, kept, and then result when you have thousands of those tinkerings along the way in a new species. That's the problem with evolution, and Meyer does a good job of bringing that out with one specific problem in Darwin's Doubt, which I encourage you to pick up.